In our last video, we discussed a famous objection to Anselm's ontological argument for the existence of God. Namely, it was an objection raised by a monk that was contemporary to Anselm named Gunillo, and we called the objection the perfect island objection. In this video, we're going to begin our discussion of Anselm's account of God. And we're also going to talk a little bit about the reasoning that's behind and through which he derives the account of God that he gives. So the question then is, what is God like according to Anselm? What features does Anselm attribute to God? So if you read throughout the Proslogion, you'll see Anselm ascribes various features to God. What I want to do now is read through a list I've compiled of all the main attributions that he makes to God. The first thing that he says about God, which we already discussed in the first two videos on Anselm, is that God exists. He also says he's supremely good. He depends on nothing else, or he exists through himself, to say he's self-sufficient. All things depend on him for existence and for happiness. He says as well, not only does God exist, but God cannot even be thought not to exist. God is the creator and made all other things from nothing. He's just, truthful, happy, joyful. He's percipient in the sense of being knowledgeable. He's omnipotent, right? He's all-powerful. He's merciful. He's impassible, which means he doesn't experience emotions. He's not a body. He has no spatial extension. Rather, he's spirit. He cannot be corrupted in any way. He cannot lie. He cannot cause what is true to be false. Right? So there are things God can't do. Right? He's all powerful, but there are things that he can't do. He can't be corrupted. He cannot lie. He cannot cause what is true to be false. So in Anselm thinking God is all powerful, that doesn't mean simply that he can do anything. There's restrictions on that, which we'll come to as we move through these videos. He's living, he's wise, he's eternal, he exists everywhere. He's spatially unbounded, he's wholly present everywhere. He's not subject to the law of space. He's spatially omnipresent. He exists always, so at all times. He's temporally unbounded. He's not subject to the law of time. In other words, we could say he's temporally omnipresent. He's light. He is greater than can be thought. In other words, he can't be fully grasped. He's beautiful, harmonious, fragrant, savory. These might sound strange. He's fragrant, savory, soft. He's not composed of parts, cannot be broken up. He's completely one, simple, alone. He is what he is. He's also necessary. He can't but be. And his life is wholly present to him. So the way that we experience our life is in parts, right? I have a different experience at one time than I do at another. And at no time am I experiencing the whole of my life, directly anyway, all at once. You could say, well, I could go back and, through memory, but you couldn't do that. We don't have the capacity to do that all at once. And anyway, it would not be a direct experience. It would be an experience of it through memories, which are kind of seem to be copies of parts of your experience. So God, his life isn't present to him in parts, right? His life he experiences it all at once, eternally. So the comparable way to think about how this would work for a human would be, imagine if from the time you came into being to the time you go out, you don't just experience segments of that, one experience at a time, but you experience the whole thing all at once. That's still, that can kind of give you an idea of how about God's life, or how he experiences life, but it still doesn't fully capture it, because our experience of life has a beginning and an end, or at least a beginning, but God's has no beginning and has no end. So he experiences everything all at once, always. So if we're going to visually represent this briefly, we could say, the way that a human being's life is present to him or her is in bits and pieces at a time, right? So they experience this time, this time, this time, this time, in this sequence, and they never, for example, experience T9 before T1 or simultaneous with T1. They're sequential. Then they have this experience and this experience and this experience, and so on. And then if when you're dead, that's it, then that's the end of it, right? So if we take the human being's life to consist in the experiences at all these times, the way the person lives that is moment to moment. Whereas God doesn't experience first one part of his life and then another. He experiences all of his life all at once, always, right? So there is no beginning, no end for God. So all of this at once, simultaneously, everything at once. Let me give you a kind of flavor for what the idea is when he says God experiences his life all at once, or his life is wholly present to him. There's more to say on that, but it gives you a taste of it. So, having kind of read through the list of characteristics that Anselm attributes to God, what I want to do now is turn to discussing the reasoning behind which he makes these attributions. So, if you haven't taken a course in medieval philosophy or read Anselm, just stop someone on the street and you say, hey, what are the main characteristics of God? But a lot of people would be able to at least name three. He's all-knowing, he's all-powerful, and he's all-good. And if they're even a little more savvy, they may use the fancy jargon that's usually used to express these characteristics. He's omniscient, he's omnipotent, and he's omnibenevolent. But the question that we're going to turn to now is, on what basis are those characteristics attributed to God? And specifically, on what basis does Anselm attribute those characteristics and all the others in that list to God? So let's have a look at that reasoning now. Wait up, you out of your freaking mind. We're not done yet. They're going to have some questions about these attributes. Right. Like, for example, how can God be beautiful?
I got it.
And yet not have a body?
Okay.
Right?
Jeez.
What's up with that?
I got
and other things. Don't you think you want to say something about that? Okay, I'll say something. Jeez. All right, so if you look down through this list, there seems to be kind of tension between properties that Anselm attributes to God. Well, first off, there seems to be questions about what these attributes consist in, and second of all, there seems to be tensions between them. For example, as that guy pointed out, carry on. How could God be beautiful and yet lack a body. What's going on there? Again, how could God be omnipotent or all-powerful, and yet there be things that he can't do? For example, he can't tell a lie, he can't be corrupted, he can't cause what's true to be false. Also, how could he not have a body and be soft? What gives there? What's going on? How can he be just and merciful? So, as I said a few videos ago, we're going to be looking at some of these attributes in more detail. We can't do all of them, given the amount of them. So we're going to be looking at some of these attributes and talking more about what they mean in more detail in upcoming videos. And then we're also going to be talking about some of what seemed to be the tensions between the various attributes he ascribes to God, and how Anselm resolves or attempts to resolve those tensions to show that they're not tensions, and really when you understand each of those attributes in themselves sufficiently. So now, having discussed the list of attributes and foreshadowed some of the further discussions we're going to have regarding them, what I want to do now is turn to the reasoning that Anselm employs in order to derive this list of characteristics which he attributes to God. So then, on what basis does Anselm attribute these features to God? Well, he does so on the basis of what I'm going to call greatest conceivable being theology. And greatest conceivable being theology is the study of God's nature on the basis of his being that than which a greater being cannot be conceived. So it's to study God's nature, starting with that definition of God that Anselm gives early on in the Proslogion, that God is that than which a greater being cannot be conceived or cannot be thought. So let's look now at the reasoning into which that definition of God plays a part in order to derive the list of attributes that Anselm gives in his account of God. Right? So here's the logical structure of greatest conceivable being theology, or the reasoning that's involved there. So, 1, a being that is Y is greater than one that is not Y. 2, so if God is not Y, then God is not that than which a greater being cannot be conceived. 3, but God is that than which a greater being cannot be conceived. That's the very definition of God. Therefore, God is Y. So this structure of reasoning seems to be behind all the characteristics that Anselm attributes to God throughout the Proslogion. And what I have here on the right is an example of that reasoning in play, which is going to use the attribute of justness, or being just. So if we take the abstract form of the reasoning on the left and we plug into those variables actual attributes, and in this case we're going to use justice, then we can see how he's going to derive the claim that God is just. Here's the example. 1, a being that is just is greater than one that is not just. So 2, if God is not just, God is not that than which a greater being cannot be thought. 3, but God is that than which a greater being cannot be thought. That's the definition of God. 4, thus God is just. Right? If he wasn't just, then he wouldn't be that than which a greater being cannot be thought. But he is by definition. Therefore, he is just. So if you look at the reasoning, note that sometimes for the claim in 1, Anselm takes that to be intuitive. You know, that it's better, a being that's just is greater than one that is not. A being that is wise is greater than one that is not. A being that is supremely good is greater than one that is not, and so on and so on. He takes those claims, those greatness claims to be, or greater than claims to be intuitive, and doesn't give arguments for them, though sometimes he does. Okay, right, so you can go down through the list and you can see how, given this type of reasoning, one could derive the list of attributes that Augustine ascribes to God throughout the proslogium. Now, there are other ways that one could come to form an account of God. For example, there's what's sometimes called perfect being theology, which is very close and maybe even be the same way to understand God. The idea with perfect being theology is you start with the idea that God is absolutely perfect, and then from that you derive the attributes that he has. So, a simple example of how that might go is, God is absolutely perfect. Justice is a perfection, therefore God is just. Or God is absolutely perfect. Wisdom is a perfection, therefore God is wise. Yet another way you could come to form an account of God that's different from greatest conceivable being theology and perfect being theology, maybe biblical theology. That's where you attempt to form an account of God on the basis of the things that are said about God in the Bible, and so on. And Anselm, being a Christian, would ultimately take the picture he arrives at of God through greatest conceivable being theology and the one that one would arrive at through biblical theology to be compatible, to be no conflict. So there's interesting questions there which we're not going to go into, but there's different ways to know God, and given that Anselm does greatest conceivable being theology, he also believes that the Bible is true. He would ultimately take and attempt to show that both accounts of God that can be derived through biblical theology or greatest conceivable being theology, which is the method that he uses, are compatible. So in this video, we discussed Anselm's account of God, the list of characteristics he attributes to God throughout the proslogium. And we said a little bit about them. We talked about how they could seem to be in tension. We're going to go into that further. But we also talked about the reasoning behind which he generates that list, which we're calling greatest conceivable being theology. In the upcoming videos, we're going to pay special focus or attention to some of the characteristics that Anselm attributes to God. Specifically, we're going to look at and go deeper into what it means for God to be spatially omnipresent, temporally omnipresent, and simple. And in the next video in particular, we're going to focus on his claim that God is spatially omnipresent. So what does that mean, and how is that different from other ways of being present? That's what we're going to look at in the next video. So I'll see you in the next video. Dr. K out.